Today we'll be talking about ludicrously armoured infantry and dreadnoughts, and seeing how the Space Marine Elite's choices have got on in the new edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're going to have a bit of a wander through the Space Marine Elite's choices, and talk about which units I think will be seeing more play in the new edition, both in terms of their rules changes, and of course the all-important points. We'll go for Elite Infantry first, then move on into Dreadnoughts, and then touch briefly on the characters in the Elite section. Let's jump straight into it. So starting off with the Armoured Infantry then. Space Marines aren't in short supply of armoured infantry that can spit loads of bolter shots, then move on to punching you with a power fist in close combat. There's always a bit of a contention between aggressors, assault centurions and terminators for this role, and the balance has been fairly heftily disrupted in this move. Prior to this I would have said that assault centurions were the strongest, followed by aggressors, stats wise at least, then followed by terminators, but in this points change, assault centurions went up the most, then aggressors, then terminators, meaning that it's just going to be a lot more of a decision. Aggressors are now 45 points with their Boltstorm and Fragstorm gauntlets, and 40 points with the Flamestorm, meaning that it's now a little bit more of a decision between these two, rather than just automatically picking the Boltstorm every single time. I still think in general it will be the way to go for most armies, but if you're using Salamanders, then maybe the Flamestorms will get more of a look in, particularly using long-range marksmen for an extra 3 inches of flamer range, and then being able to put them in strategic reserve to come in from the sides. In general though, aggressors marching up the board I still think will be a viable thing, particularly when they're combined with powerful defensive buffs, such as say an Invul save from Ironfather Fyros or Dark Angel's Azrael, and perhaps any Feel No Pain type saves that you can get, such as that Chief Apothecary from Psychic Awakening. The standard loadout for Assault Centurions has been heavily hit as well. An Assault Centurion with Hurricane Bolter and Flamers will now set you back a pretty princely 70 points, going up in points cost by a lot more than the average unit. I think it is fair enough seeing as these guys were pretty undercosted before, and I'm still not honestly convinced they're completely dead in the water if you are using them for armies such as Raven Guard for example. Having a 4 or 5 man squad of these guys jump in, throw bolter shots everywhere, then pretty much auto-delete something in close combat will still be very strong. Again though, I think we might start to see some other variants of these being run. Melters went down in cost as well, so it might not be the worst thing in the world running them with 2 melter guns, and being quite a credible threat to heavies both in shooting and the fight phase, rather than the Hurricane Bolter. If you just take them with assault launchers and flamers, then they still can actually be quite cheap at 55 points per model for a lot of melee might. Finally, Terminators only received a very small points increase, particularly the assault variant. Regular Terminators have gone up from 34 points to 36 when you include their Power Fist and Storm Bolter, far below average, and is definitely going to narrow the gap between them and the aggressors and assault centurions. Cataphracti and Tartarus are pretty much unchanged respective to them. The Tartarus are the same price and the Cataphracti are plus 2 points as before. The Cyclone missile launchers I think might come back a little bit as well. They're now only 25 points, down from 32, and that's really not a bad price to pay for a couple of missile launcher shots to come in as your unit comes down. I think the Dark Angels, Deathwing, Space Wolves, and maybe other armies such as White Scars will certainly be able to make a bit more use of Terminators now than before. If you did prefer the assault variant of Terminators as well, then Lightning Claws are completely unchanged, and Thunder's Hammers and Storm Shields only went up 1 point to 42 points. So far Storm Shields aren't changed throughout the Greater Space Marine Codex. I think they will be a bit worse when they are, as I think that a 3+ Invul is more valuable than the +1 to saves and a 4+ Invul. Nevertheless though, going down far more than average is a really good news for Terminators. I honestly think that it's fairly close between these different versions of Elite Power Fist armed infantry now. I think that all of them are still usable, particularly the aggressors and assault centurions in armies that can deep strike such as Raven Guard, although perhaps more so for everyone now strategic reserves are a thing. Terminators were the weakest, but they received the smallest points increase, so are more viable than ever they were. Perhaps at some point I'll think about doing a bit more math hammer to weigh up the pros and cons of these guys' offensive and defensive stats. If we move on to looking at veterans now, then it's not quite as much good news. These guys weren't quite as viable in my opinion before the changes, and most of them went up by pretty decent amounts as well. Standard veteran profiles went up from 14 points to 17 points, a 21% increase which is above the standard. Sternguard and Vanguard veterans weren't bad, but I think their uses were already a bit more niche than the more heavily armoured elites, and this isn't really going to help them all that much. I don't think that we'll see anywhere near as many bolter-armed Sternguards now, although some of the combi weapons did improve a bit. They're all 10 points now. So if you did want to pack a whole load of Sternguard with combi melters into a drop pod, then the points of that has actually gone down slightly. Not too bad if you were doing some sort of Salamanders related strategy perhaps. Vanguard veterans, on the other hand, are really not looking great without jump packs, but the more common jump pack armed variant only went up 12%, up to 19 points, so not too bad and kind of in line with average. Their war gear took a few interesting changes. Thunderhammers dropped to 15 from 16, and Lightning Claws dropped down to 5 from 7, so if you want a lighter power weapon, a single Lightning Claw would certainly be the way that I'd go at the moment. Power Fists went up 1 point from 9 points to 10. Probably the biggest hit to the Vanguard veterans are the changes to Storm Shields. They're now 4 points now rather than 2, so unfortunately they're a bit more of a luxury commodity rather than something that you just throw on every single guy. Because of that change, I do think it is a bit of a slight nerf to Vanguards in this update. Company veterans have increased similarly. Primaris Reavers have pretty much increased in line with the other units, which I don't think was really good enough for them. They were already at least fairly underwhelming and not a troops choice, so I think they could have done with a below average points increase if we wanted them to see more play. Finally, Servitors went up from 5 points to 7 points, so a unit of 4 of them will now cost you 28. Still not great to be honest, but if you do need a really cheap screen for a Space Marine army, then it's not really the worst points cost in the world for the utility that provides. There are far cheaper screening units than something like Space Marine Scouts now, for example. Overall, from the elite infantry squads from the Codex, I think we are going to see a lot more Terminators in the future. Points changes wise, they really have won out by quite a bit, and I think that we'll still see plenty of aggressors around as well. If we move on to looking at some of the combat walkers and dreadnoughts of the elite section, these guys actually really haven't come out too badly whatsoever. The 9th edition rules changes have been really kind to vehicles. Pretty much all of these guys were taking heavy weapon move and shoot penalties whenever they moved around, but now they can happily move and fire away at their ballistic skill 3+, so they're either gaining movement or accuracy depending on which one you were using more. They're also able to fire all of their very nasty weapons in close combat too, which means they're either very risky to lock up, or they might even be able to just blaze away, sort of like they had pistol weapons if they were charging down the enemy and the enemy stayed in combat. I honestly wouldn't have been too surprised if they'd gone up in points by a fair bit more, but they really haven't done too badly. The Invicta Tactical Warsuits took the biggest jump out of the Codex options, going up to 165 from 136 if you equipped it with the autocannons, and both the Incendium Cannon and the Twin Iron Hail autocannon are now the same points. To be honest, I don't think that this is too bad now. I think the Incendium Cannon did get a relative buff, as if you're in combat with it now, being able to flame away and auto-hit is going to be really scary. Honestly, with the additional abilities that it gained, I think that Invictus are pretty much just as scary as they were before, and have not lost any viability despite this points increase. Standard Dreadnoughts and Venerable Dreadnoughts weren't quite as good before the changes. Unfortunately, they have received a below average points increase. The base Dreadnought chassis is up to 70 from 60, and the Venerable Dreadnoughts up to 85 from 80. Their war gear has largely stayed the same though. From Mathhammer that I'd done previously, I think that the Venerable Dreadnought was generally the way to go out of the two beforehand, and it looks like it's now even more the way to go after. The extra points cost does tend to buy you a proportionally better amount of defensibility from that 6-up Feel No Pain, plus of course the extra accuracy from Ballistic Skill 2+. Between the vehicle rule changes and a really tiny points increase, Venerable Dreadnoughts with twin lascannons and missile launchers are certainly more viable than they were previously. Ironclads have seen another similarly small points increase. To be fair, I think that these guys did need a small buff, seeing as they weren't really seeing any sort of play compared with the other Dreadnoughts. I'm not sure that this change will be enough to actually make them viable, seeing as they are quite slow, but of course it's certainly not going to hurt. It's worth noting that Hunter-Killer missiles are now only 5 points, and now you can move and fire them. They're far more viable on an Ironclad for a nice early alpha strike. The Redemptor Dreadnoughts are up to 180 from 157. A pretty much similar story to the Invicta here. That's pretty much in line with other points increases across the game, and being able to move and fire with heavy weapons is excellent for these, as is being able to blaze away in close combat. I thought I would also touch on the Forge World Dreadnought special rules here, seeing as we are talking about Dreadnoughts in general. I'm a little bit skeptical as to how long that these might take effect, seeing as Games Workshop is supposedly going to be reissuing Forge World datasheets at some point. But until then, it seems that the Quad Laz Relic Contemptor Dreadnought is pretty much the undisputed winner of the Elite section. For some reason it went down in points to be exactly the same cost as the standard Contemptor Dreadnought now, despite the big gain that it gets of having the extra wounds and the Feel No Pain type save, which really up its durability. In terms of firepower output, this thing was already probably the strongest thing in the Codex in terms of blasting away with las cannons, and needless to say, while we're in this sort of rules limbo, it's only got better. Certainly a top tier unit and no mistake. The same can't be said for the Deredeo. It's gone up by more points than the vast majority of things, up to 250 if you want those Anvilus autocannons. And surprisingly enough, the Relic Leviathan Dreadnought hasn't seen too bad a points increase in itself. Again, it's gone up in line with average, and it's a far more fearsome prospect on the board, being able to move and fire with that very scary 2+ ballistic skill, and arguably losing a very major weakness because it can now just blaze away with those storm cannons in close combat at a -1 to hit penalty that it barely cares about. It is a bit of a strange world to see things like the Relic Leviathan get buffed on the transition to a new edition with new points costs. I'm not sure I'd necessarily rush out to buy these sort of things though. I would wait to see what they do with the new Forge World rules, as they might significantly change things up. In general though, with the current rules, I'd say that every single Dreadnought aside from the Derrideo is a winner out of this, and the Invicta is more or less the same as it was before, gaining points but also gaining abilities. Finally, I just thought I'd touch on the characters in the Elite section. No major changes here really. The Apothecary went up to 55 points, where the Primaris Apothecary stayed level, though to be honest, Apothecaries don't really care too much about having 1 extra wound and an extra attack, so I think they're still pretty much both fine to use, and I'm sure they'll continue to be used very regularly while that Chief Apothecary rule exists, and again give a feel no pain aura to Infantry. For some reason Ancients took a bit of flack in the update. They're significantly more expensive than most character rises, so if you do want to shoot with dead models in your opponent's turn, then you are going to need to pay a little bit more for it. As before, they'll still probably be very worth it in armies with a big shooting castle, and probably not worth it quite so much if they're only buffing 1 or 2 units. Finally, the Company Champion has gone up pretty much in line with most characters. Hopefully at some point he'll get those same mastercrafted power sword special rules as the Blade Guard gets. Getting up to strength 5 might be a bit more helpful to him, and actually get him to see play in a list or 2 perhaps. So overall, the Space Marine Elite section has come out fairly well out of these changes. The biggest winners I think were Terminators and Dreadnoughts, and the biggest losers Veterans and Assault Centurions. If you'd like to let me know how this might change your army building going forward, then please feel free to leave any insights in the comments down below. It'd be interesting to see what you're thinking of taking in 9th. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly have plenty more Space Marine content coming out as we move into 9th edition. If you were thinking about buying in any of these guys or any other 40k stuff in the near future, I'd just like to mention that I do have an Element Games link in the video description below that can help support the channel if you'd like to. Basically, if you were thinking about buying any models, then if you live in the UK or Europe, you can click that link and order through them. Element has good customer service and gives a 10 to 20% discount on Warhammer models, and if you order something after clicking the link, then a little bit goes to help support Auspex Tactics, as well as costing you no extra time of purchase. It can just be a way to help keep the channel going, while also not spending anything that you weren't going to already. I also have a very similar link for Amazon in the USA and Canada. Again, that works pretty much in the same way. If you click on the link and then buy something, then a small amount of the money goes to help support the channel, and again it doesn't cost you any more. They do stock pretty much all of Games Workshop's range if you're interested. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.